Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to endure on the daily, this little crazy thing that we call life, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the forgotten potential victims of Scottish serial killer Angus Sinclair. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us, one of us, one of us. And you can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. They're all Bratterstein, but no pressure. So guess what, guys? Today's video is sponsored by Dossier. Now, if you don't know who Dossier is, which you should if you've been on this channel before because we hang out a lot, but if you're not familiar with who Dossier is, you're about to get familiar with who Dossier is. Dossier is a fragrance company that creates luxury scents, but at a fraction of the luxury price tag, where most perfumes, luxury perfumes, can cost anywhere from, wait for it, $50 to hundreds of dollars. How dare they? Dossier's perfumes range from $29 to $49, and they offer bulk deals with up to 25% off and also free shipping for when you buy three bottles or more. And I know that that sounds like a deal that's too good to be true, but I promise you it's true. Like, this is real life. This is real life. Okay, so I have two scents to share with you today, and oh my god, let me open it up and tell you all about them. So the first scent I got to share with you today is Musky Green Tea. And it's inspired by the Silver Mountain Water perfume by the brand Creed. I'm not familiar with that brand. I've only known Creed as something totally different and not a fragrance company. But this was a little bit of a departure for me, something different. These are not like the notes I generally go for. And it smells very like earthy and herbal. And I don't know if this one's supposed to be unisex, but it smells like it is intended to be unisex. I mean, really, what scent is not unisex, right? Technically speaking, but this is one that I know my husband's gonna smell and he's gonna take this one for me. He took another one that I got in the past. I can't remember which one it was, but this one, I know he's gonna be like, oh, so that's mine, right? Right. So ladies, gentlemen, anyone who wants to smell delicious musky green tea. The next scent I got is Aquatic Vanilla, and this is inspired by the perfume Vanilla Vibes by Juliet Has a Gun. And that is actually a perfume that I have wanted to try, but here's the thing. The bottle's like $100 for like a little tiny bottle, and I cannot justify that price tag. Not in my tax bracket. I mean, come on. Absolutely not. But oh my god. It smells exactly the same. It smells so good. Like, this one is going to be one of my favorite. I can tell already. Like, I'm gonna wear this all the time. And the best part of Dossier for me, which obviously, like, the scent is the best part, arguably, but something that's very important to me is that Dossier is a cruelty-free fragrance brand where most luxury perfume brands are not. And on top of that, they're like literally a fraction of the price of luxury brands. So really, it's just a win in my book. Anyways, guys, Dossier is offering members of the Brat Pack 10% off of their purchase of their new favorite perfume today with the code BRATTERSTEIN at checkout. And like, it's already such a good deal, and then you get 10% off. I can't imagine you're gonna find a better deal out there. So if you are as interested in this as I am, because you guys know I love Dossier, go make sure to click the link in my description box and use the code BRATTERSTEIN at checkout for 10% off your new favorite perfume today. And I want to say a big thank you to Dossier for working with me again on yet another video, and a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. So now that I'm done spreading the good word of Dossier, we can go ahead and get into this video. Now, this video is actually kind of like a part 2 to last week's video. If you didn't see last week's video, I would suggest watching it. We discussed serial killer Angus Sinclair. We talked about his backstory, and we specifically focused on the famous World's End murders, which was the murders of 17-year-old Christine Eady and 17-year-old Helen Scott. These two girls were out in Scotland bar hopping, and they ended their night at a bar called the World's End. And they were last seen there alive, leaving in the company of 2 older men. The following day, both girls were found stripped, bound, gagged, beaten, and strangled. And this case ended up being one of the most famous cases and one of the longest murder investigations ever in the area. And in learning about Angus Sinclair and having forensic scientists look into other older cold cases that were committed around the same time as Helen and Christine's murders, they were able to connect Angus Sinclair to 4 other unsolved murders in addition to the murders of Helen and Christine. And that's on top of 2 other murders that he was convicted of that we touched on a little bit in last week's video, but we're going to dive into more thoroughly in this video. And that was the murders of 7-year-old Catherine Rehill and 17-year-old Mary Gallacher. Now that sounds like a lot of murders, right? Like that's a lot of people that this guy is already suspected of killing. Well, in doing all my research, good mythical morning. On top of that, in doing my research, I found that he's been linked to at least 2 other murders. So we have a lot to discuss in this video. So today what I'm going to be doing, which is a little different than usual, is I'm going to be going over the timeline. Basically, I'm going to be telling the story of all of these unsolved murders because when I was looking into the World's End murders, that's the case that I was looking into first. And while I was looking into their case, it was very tragic, and I was noticing that all of the other people that he was suspected of killing or convicted of killing were kind of footnotes in basically every retelling I heard and read about when it came to the World's End murders. It was like, Angus Sinclair is known for these murders and these just kind of happened. And I was like, well, that's kind of sad, really, because these are still people that lost their lives just because he wasn't able to be convicted of them, and just because they didn't get as popular doesn't mean that they're not worth discussing. So I looked into them because I was very interested, and it was a lot because it's just so many people, but I wanted to bring their stories to you as well because they also matter. So I did all the research and read all the things so you don't have to. Now, today I'm going to tell you the whole story. And while I do, I'm going to be putting on a full face of makeup, hence the makeup and morbid makeup. Now, if that's not really your thing, that's cool. Thanks for hanging out this long. I hope you find a channel that you prefer that covers this story and covers these additional victims. But if you're kind of on the fence, you're not sure how you feel, maybe stick around. I think you could be surprised by how much you like it, and also me. What else? Oh, if you're ever curious what makeup I'm using, it will be in the description box for your convenience. Now, after I give you all the details of this case, I want you to answer the question of the day, and that is this. Do you believe that these victims are victims of serial killer Angus Sinclair, or do you think that their killers are unknown people who are still out there? Let me know in the comments below. Now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the potential forgotten victims of Angus Sinclair. Okay, so for this video, I'm going to kind of go in I'm definitely going to go in chronological order because I feel like that's just going to make the most sense when talking about his victims. So I'm going to start with his first known kill, which I do think is likely his first kill because of how young he was when he committed this. And this was the murder of 7-year-old Catherine Rehill. And Angus was arrested and convicted for this murder when he was just 16 years old. Okay, so this murder took place on July 1st, 1961, when Angus was, as I said, 16 years old. So on this day, Angus was home alone when he noticed a young girl just going down the street. She was described as skipping down the street, though I don't know how they would really know that. I guess somebody could have seen her, and that's how they knew that. But either way, he noticed a little girl going down the street, and he targeted her basically. And this little girl was 7-year-old Catherine Rehill. And what's really sad about this, I mean, there's everything about this is sad because this is a 7-year-old child, but something that's really sad is like Catherine wasn't even from this area. She was just visiting. Her and her little sister Margaret and her little brother Jim were staying with like her cousins, I believe is what it was, because their parents, Vera and Patrick was his name, they were in London because they were planning to move there. So they were just kind of like looking things over and making arrangement for this move. So Angus approached Catherine and he asked her if she wouldn't mind running an errand for him, which I don't know if this was just more common to be a thing back then where older kids would ask younger kids to run errands for him, or if this was just like an Angus thing, but he asked her if she'd run an errand for him and she's like, absolutely, that sounds great. So he gives her the money to go and get whatever it is that he needed, and she ran off to some nearby shops to get it for him. I couldn't find out what she was doing for him, but I know that she went off to some shops to get something for him. And when she came back, he got her to go into his house. How? I'm not exactly sure. Some reports said that he was just like getting her to go give the change to his mother, even though she wasn't there. But the point is, he got her in the house. And as soon as he got her in the house where she was out of sight of other people and no longer safe, he attacked her. He brutally assaulted and raped this 7-year-old child before strangling her to death with the tube from a bicycle tire. Now that's already horrible, right? Like that's unfathomable. But what makes it even more messed up to me is that in the middle of committing this assault, somebody came and knocked on his door. Like a neighbor came over and he was able to like turn himself off, go down, answer the door, talk to the neighbor and get them to leave, and then went back up to finish the job he was doing. Like that is just, to be able to do that, to be able to turn it on and off like that at 16 years old is just like wild to me. I guess it's possible that he like was freaking out, but the neighbor didn't say that he seemed weird. Said that he seemed totally normal, totally fine. He was in control of himself. And I find that to be very scary for somebody to be able to do at such a young age. Like when you hear about that, to me, I'm like, that is frightening. So when 16-year-old Angus was done assaulting and murdering this child, what he did to try to get away with what he did is horrifying as well. He fixed her clothes like on her lower half so that it could conceal any evidence of a sexual assault. And then he took her and he threw her body down a stairwell outside to make it look like she fell down the stairs. And then went on to act totally normal, like nothing had happened. And she got found really quickly by, I think it was 2 women who were going, like leaving to go and play bingo. And they found her like, oh my God. And then Angus runs out of his apartment acting like, oh my God, what happened? What happened? And like when he's like found her like they did, he's like, oh, I'll call an ambulance, don't worry. And he actually called the ambulance himself, telling the operator, quote, "A wee girl has fallen down the stairs." This poor little girl had blood on her nose and like a large bruise on her forehead, and she died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Which means that she was still technically, I mean, this could be wrong. It could have been that she was already dead, but she was pronounced dead on the ambulance ride over. But if she was still alive, that means that he choked her and then threw her down the stairs alive. And that's just like, that's a baby, you know? It's a baby. Catherine's cousin Anne, who she was staying with at the time, said later in an interview of this day, and I quote, "I remember the police coming to the door. It was chaotic. It was really bad. Everybody didn't know what to do. They couldn't believe it. And people thought it was me because we looked alike. We were cousins, but friends. And as I said, she just loved life. Never in a million years would you ever think that this would happen." So after the murder, all the tenants in like the building where it happened started coming out into the common areas, you know, seeing what happened, being nosy, and also like consoling each other because this is horrible. This is a little child that just, to them, fell down the stairs and died. You know what I mean? Like it's really, really horrible. And neighbors noted that Angus was out there chatting away, talking to people, acting like nothing had ever happened. And he even like went over to see his older brother, to like create an alibi, it seems like, or at least just to make himself seem like everything was normal, like he had no care in the world. He just went to go and hang out with his brother, like this was nothing to him. But it didn't work because police did bring him in for questioning, and they tried to question him because they like, I don't know how they knew that he did it, but they seemed to know he did it, and they were trying to get him to confess, but they were unsuccessful. So they actually commissioned his brother, and I think his brother's name was John, and they were like, we need you to try to get him to confess because we know that he did it, you know? So they bring his brother in, and his brother is able to get him to confess. He said that it only took him like 30 minutes of talking to Angus, and Angus was willing to tell police what happened. And he said that his brother didn't seem sorry, didn't seem remorseful at all. He said that Angus was a, quote, cold boy. And he says that he wishes that at that point in time, he could have stopped his brother in his tracks. Honestly, like, his brother was pretty ruthless. Like, he clearly is not about Angus's bullshit. And he said specifically of stopping his brother in his tracks, and I quote, "I would have done time for him. I would have killed him. If I'd known years ago, I'd have pushed him in the bloody canal. And all of these people, all these girls, would never have had that." That is... I know people are like, blood is thicker than water, but like when your blood is like a piece of shit leech little fuck. I said I was going to stop cussing so much on my channel. I literally just told myself yesterday, I was like, listen, don't put cuss words in your notes so that you'll stop saying them when you're filming. Yeah, that didn't really go how I said, right? Anyways, when your family member is a bad person, maybe don't be on their side anymore. I don't know. Anyways, his brother has since disowned him, as I'm sure you could gather by his statement. And Angus, the day after the murder, was arrested, and he was charged and pled guilty to culpable homicide because he was underage at the time, so he got a more lenient sentence. But he was going to be serving his time at an adult prison because the judge was like, you are a messed up kid. And man, police were like shocked. They were shocked by him. They were shocked by this crime because not only did he like rape and kill a 7-year-old, but the like thoughtfulness and methodical nature in which he disposed of her body to try to like hide what he did just seemed too detached and advanced and just scary. The judge at the time described Angus as, quote, callous, cunning, and wicked, end quote, and said that he was obsessed with sex and that he was capable of taking a life to satisfy his lust, and that if this compulsion wasn't addressed, he would likely reoffend. He was said not to be remorseful at all, and if anything, he was kind of enjoying himself when he did it and after the fact. And he was evaluated, obviously, at that time, and in a psychiatric report, like a psychotherapist's report, after he was evaluated at that time, which was when he was 16 in 1961, the doctor basically said, listen, this guy is a problem. He's going to remain a problem. I don't think anything that we can do would actually help him at this point because of the levels of depravity he's willing to go to. I don't think we can even fix him. And if given the chance, he will absolutely reoffend no matter what he says to the contrary. Which is that is a heavy statement when talking about a 16-year-old kid. So Angus's mother came out after he confessed to what he did, and she speculated on whether his father dying might have had something to do with how he turned out, because I guess his father died when he was pretty young. I think he was 4, if I remember from last week correctly. And his mom said that Angus was a sweet boy, a good boy, but that recently, at about the age of 13, he had started to change and he had started to scare her. So that's a lot. That's not what you want when you have a child. You do not want to be afraid of your child. Remember back when I did that video on Zachary Davis, I was like, this is why I'm not having kids, because I don't want to be afraid of my kid killing me, but this is, it's horrible. It's just horrible, dude. It's how does this happen? How does this happen to somebody so young? Anyway, after their daughter died, Catherine's parents ended up making that trip to London, that move to London that they planned on doing. I'm sure at this point they just needed to get away, right? How do you stay in they were already planning on going, but if they hadn't been planning on going, how do you stay in a place that you lived in with your child and look at their room and see that they're not there? It just sounds so sad. So they moved to London, and her mother, who was absolutely grief-stricken, as I'm sure you can imagine, how can you lose your little baby and not be? She died in her 50s, and people think it had something to do with her having a broken heart. But that could also just be sensationalizing something, but I don't know, it seems like the type of thing that if you were to lose your child, it would be pretty hard to take care of yourself physically, because why would it matter at that point? I don't know. It's just sad. Kids getting killed is just so sad to me. But meanwhile, they moved to London. She dies grief-stricken. It's really horrible. Angus, who was given 10 years, was let out after 6. Did a whole whopping 6 years for murdering a child, which is okay. And before he was released from jail, though, he was able to learn a skill while in jail, because rehabilitation, and he learned how to be a painter and a decorator, and he took this skill with him when he got out of jail. He ended up getting a job as a decorator, and he would go on to use this job as a way to have a cover, so he could go out and commit horrible, horrible offenses. He would literally go to work and leave on his lunch break, go out, assault people, rob people, rape people, and then come back to work and act like nothing had happened. It was shortly after being released that Angus actually met this young nurse. They got married, they had a baby. To all untrained eyes, it seemed like he was doing good, like he was rehabilitated. But, spoiler alert, he was not. This now brings us to Angus's next suspected victim, and this was 25-year-old mother of 4 young children named Helen Kane, who is described as a, quote, attractive and quiet person who lived for her children. Now, it does appear that at one point, former Deputy Chief Constable Tom Woods, Mr. Tom, is what I'm going to call him. Well, he didn't think that Helen's case was linked with Angus, but it's unclear what he thinks today. But Helen is believed by some to be a victim of Angus Sinclair. So that's why I'm including her today, and she would be the next in the timeline. So on this night, Helen and her husband Joe left their four small children with Helen's sister Janet. But after this night that was supposed to be like a fun night out for a couple, Helen never came home again. I guess Helen and Joe had gone out with a couple of their friends, and this was like a rare occasion for the couple. They didn't really get to go out much. I mean, they had 4 small kids. Like, I now have 1 small kid, and I haven't gone out in ages, so I understand that this is just like a thing that you don't do as much once you have kids, or that some people choose not to do as much when they have kids. So this was like a rare fun time for them. And them and all of their friends were going to this place called the Dockers Club. Now, it's unclear as to why this happened. I could not find an explanation as to why, but at some point during the evening, Helen ended up leaving her group, and a woman matching her description was seen getting into a cab with a man, and at about 11:30 that night. And I really wish that this portion of the story could be explained to me, because it doesn't make sense to me why she would have just like left her friends and also her husband, because part of the reason that they were out and like on this rare occasion they were out is because Helen and Joe were celebrating their anniversary. They had been together for 7 years, but for whatever reason she left. And again, I can't figure out why this was, and I wish that I could. Now, the only thing I could find that would sort of explain why she might have been leaving early was from her Helen's goddaughter and like niece, I think is what she was. Her name was Anne Marie, is the point. And Anne Marie gave a quote that I found that kind of explained why Helen might have left. And it seems like she might have been leaving early because she wanted to get home to her babies. And Anne Marie said specifically, so that you can kind of put 2 and 2 together for yourself, and I quote, "This was a really rare night out for her, but even so, she left early, we think, to get back for her kids. She was kind and loving, and she deserves justice." During the investigation, police got a lot of leads as to like where Helen might have gone. In addition to that one reporting of seeing somebody who looked like her getting into a taxi with some man, there was also a report of somebody seeing the same couple, who's believed to be the same couple, leaving a taxi near the area where her body would eventually be found. But again, there's conflicting sightings of her, because in addition to that, some people thought they saw her, and police believed that this was an actual like legit sighting. Some people thought they saw her getting on a bus with another woman, and police tried their hardest to even track down who this woman might have been. Like, they were trying to find her, trying to see if they could figure out if anyone had seen them on the bus. But the woman who they believe that she went off with has never been like identified either. Now, on the day that would have been Helen's wedding anniversary, May 25th, 1970, her body was found. Helen Kane's body was discovered in a shallow building site excavation by a man who was out walking his dog. And she had died from head injuries from being beaten by a slab, which I guess is like a big piece of rock. Now, police did everything they could to try to solve this case, right? They tried to locate the woman that she might have gotten on the bus with. They tried to get any and all taxi drivers to reach out to them to let them know if they had picked up a couple, like the couple who had been dropped off near the murder site. But they, and they even looked into Bible John, which is not a case that I've covered and not one I'm familiar enough with to give you like a synopsis of, but he was a killer who was active in the area or being investigated in the area at that time. And they even looked in to see if she might have been a victim of him. But every lead came back, they came back empty-handed every time. Now, a retired police officer who had worked on the World's End case did come out and say that he believes that Angus Sinclair is responsible. And clearly, police investigating the murder also thought he was responsible, or at least were talking to, because he was questioned about this. He was questioned and he gave them an alibi. And his alibi was that, a close family member said that he was with them. I wonder if this was his wife. I bet it was his wife, because what other close family members did he have? You know what I mean? At that point, they were all kind of let's get as far away from this train wreck of a human as possible. But either way, they checked him out and he had his alibi, and that was kind of that. But Angus lived less than a half a mile away from where Helen eventually was found, and he had only been out of jail for killing young Catherine for a little while when this happened. So he's definitely somebody that people think is a pretty good suspect here. Is he responsible? I don't know. But some police officers do believe that he is, and so does one of Helen's sons. Michael Caine has come out and said that he does believe that it's possible that Angus Sinclair is responsible for his mother's murder, and to this day, her case has never been solved. So now we move on to the next potential victim of Angus Sinclair, and this was a 37-year-old woman named Frances Baker, who worked as a bakery worker, actually. Baker the baker. But anyways, on the day that she went missing and was killed, she, I believe, had been visiting her sister, I believe it was, earlier in that day, which is, to me, I always think that that's pretty nice, you know, that when somebody gets killed, they have, like, you know, an opportunity to see people they loved beforehand, or for the people they loved to have the opportunity to see them beforehand. I don't know how often she went, so maybe it was like a normal day. But I said the same thing in the James Byrd Jr. video, that like just having that like good family time, I think is probably invaluable to those who get left behind. But anyway, it doesn't matter. After she left, her niece like walked her out to a taxi, and that was the last time her family ever saw her alive, but it wasn't the last time she'd be seen alive. She, like many women we're going to discuss in today's video, was last seen alive at a pub in Glasgow. Frances's body was found 2 weeks later, dumped 10 miles away from the pub in a wooded wasteland. She had been raped, her pants had been forced into her mouth as a gag, and she had been strangled. Now, I mentioned this in last week's video, but there actually was somebody who was arrested and convicted for Frances's murder. This was a man named Thomas Ross Young, and the evidence that they had against him was circumstantial from what I could find. There was hair consistent with Frances found in the cab of his truck, and he did say at some point that it was possible that he had killed her during a blackout, which is a bit strange, but you know, false confessions happen. But something that was not circumstantial is that it was claimed that some of Frances's items were found like in his home that he had given to his daughter, and one of these items was like a cosmetic compact. So that like isn't that circumstantial. Like, why do you have this murdered woman's items, and why are you giving them to your child? You darn tootin' creep, because I'm not cussing. Now, he was in jail for 30 years before his death in 2014 when he was 73 years old. But he whoa, my brain turned off. He did declare the entire time he was in jail that he was not responsible, and that instead it was Angus Sinclair that was responsible for Frances's murder. And okay, that's just what he's saying. But it does seem that police believed that he was involved, at least that he was involved in some capacity. Maybe not that he did it alone, but that maybe him and Thomas worked together when killing Frances, because Angus was known to not work alone when committing his murders, which is just like a whole nother level of scary to me. The idea of two people that are this effed up finding each other, like, how do you bring up that conversation? How do you feel comfortable enough to just bring up that conversation? You know what I mean? Like, no. Now, apparently Angus lived on the same street as Frances around the time that she was killed, and that he was known to go fishing in the same area where her body was disposed of. And on top of that, apparently they were able to find a link between Angus and Thomas. It said that these two were buds, and that at some point they had even lived together, and that they lived together near Frances. Now, I couldn't see if this was like confirmed. To me, it seems like it's possible, at least, that this link was kind of police's attempt to like cover their ass a little bit, be like, listen, yes, we convicted this man and he is in jail. And yes, it does seem like Angus Sinclair might have been involved, but he was involved also. We didn't mess up here. They were buddies. They knew each other. They lived together. They did this together. Don't look at us. We didn't make mistakes. We just weren't able to get both of them. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. I don't know for sure if that's the case. That's just kind of like where my brain went, but it is definitely something that is compelling. The jury, though, clearly felt like Thomas was responsible. Like they didn't have an issue convicting him, because they literally only deliberated an hour before finding him guilty of Frances's murder. And it turns out he was a pretty violent guy already at the time that this happened. At the time he was arrested for this murder, he already had a record for assaulting sex workers. He had been found guilty of 2 attempted murders, 2 rapes, assault, robbery, and theft. And police were even suspecting him in the murder of another girl. This was a 17-year-old girl named Patricia McAdam, who was murdered in 1967. Or at least she was believed to have been murdered in 1967, but her body has never been recovered. Now, this video isn't about Patricia, and it's not about victims of other people that are somehow connected to Angus, but I feel like I can't just say her name and not talk about her at least a little bit, because like, she's 17 years old. That's super messed up. And I guess Patricia, who went by Pat, people called her Pat, she went missing in Glasgow after Glasgow? Now I forgot how to say it. Glasgow. After going to that area to go shopping and dancing with a friend. Apparently, her and this friend hitchhiked to get from point A to point B, and the two were picked up by a truck driver. This truck driver was Thomas. Her friend got off in a stop ahead of her, and she was going to ride a little bit further down and get dropped off where she needed to go. So the last time that Pat was seen alive was when her friend saw her leaving with the truck driver down towards Dumfries, which is where I guess she lived or where she was going, but she was never seen alive again. She was last seen wearing a black cocktail dress, a yellow cardigan, a purple coat, and black strapped suede shoes. Now, I guess Thomas was looking, like they were looking at Thomas in connection with her disappearance, and they were thinking about charging him. Even though they didn't have a body, they were thinking about bringing charges against him. But for whatever reason, the Crown like wanted to halt on it. They were like, we might do this, but not right now, maybe a little bit later. And then Thomas died in prison. So to this day, that's rude. To this day, her case is also still unsolved. Now, back to Frances. Police clearly thought that it was possible, at least, that Thomas wasn't actually involved with Frances's murder, even though he was convicted for it, because in 2005, which is like years after he had been convicted, they went to him and they re-questioned him, and they were basically like, listen, did you really kill her though? Like, we need to know. And I just think that that's kind of a weird thing. If he was involved, like, you should be pretty confident in that if you're gonna put somebody in jail forever. He sounds like he wasn't a great guy, but still. Don't put people in jail for things they're not guilty of, because then that's opening a door for people to be put in jail for things that they aren't guilty of. You know what I mean? Anyways. On top of police going and questioning him and all that jazz, Frances's file, her murder file, right? The jacket on her murder was also sent over to the FBI to be looked into by Operation Trinity, which shows that police believed that this case was linked to Angus Sinclair. Now, if you missed last week's video, you're probably like, what the fuck? What the darn? What the heck is Operation Trinity? Which, as I said, you should probably watch that video because you're missing a lot of vital information, but I'll give you a synopsis. Operation Trinity was essentially a task force that was put together by a bunch of retired agents from a bunch of different agencies to look over cold cases. I believe that is the wrong brush. I believe specifically from the 70s. They combed through a ridiculous amount of cold case files. And in doing so, they pulled out 6 specific files that they believed were linked and committed by the same person. They had a unique signature, if you will. So all of these files were sent over to the FBI in America, right? Me as an American, we are the FBI, yes. It's one of those things where, like, you know the answer to something, but as soon as you question it, you're like, I don't know the answer to anything. Anyways, they were sent over there, and it was determined that these 6 cases, in their opinion, were committed by the same person. Of these 6 cases were the World's End murder victims, Helen and Christine. And who was convicted of killing Helen and Christine? Angus Sinclair. So now we move on to the next possible victim of Angus Sinclair. And this was a 20-year-old woman named Anna Kenny. She was a brewery worker, and she went missing in August of 1977 after going out for a drink at a pub in Glasgow. Okay, I gotta bust out my mirror because, bro, I am blind. Absolutely blind. Like, I wear glasses. Not when I film, though, because, like, makeup. But anyway, so this is what's absolutely wild. This is something that's too coincidental, right? So Anna, she went out that night with a woman named Wilma. Now, this woman named Wilma would go on to marry a man named Gordon. And if you saw last week's video, you would know that Gordon was Angus Sinclair's accomplice in the World's End murders. Okay, so this girl who's related to these 2 killers by, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever, then goes missing and then is killed. And police were like, this is a little bit too coincidental to not be related. I hope that all made sense. I feel like my brain, like, I've been feeling like I'm not doing great lately, but I'm doing my best. Now, Ana was last seen leaving this bar with a man, and seems like the man was tracked down, and the man told police that he had left her when she went to get a taxi home, and they seemed to believe him, like that he wasn't involved, and that he had left her to get a taxi, and her body wouldn't be found for another 2 years. For 2 years after she went missing, her body was just also missing. Now, Ana's body was found 2 years later, and it wasn't her body, her skeleton was found 2 years later, and she was found in a location where Angus had actually gone on his honeymoon with his wife. When she was found, cat hair. When she was found, her hands and her feet were bound, and it says that she was raped and strangled as well, but I don't know how you could tell that from a skeleton, but I guess that's why I am not working as a forensic psychologist or a crime scene investigator, and the professionals are. Because to me, I'm like, how could you tell that if she was a skeleton? But it's reported that that is the case, so I don't know. Now, her case went cold, as all of these cases did, and after some time, her case was brought out to be re-examined, like during a cold case review. They wanted to look at the evidence and see if they could find any DNA evidence, anything that they could use to try to track down her killer, since it had been cold for so long. And Ana's aunt, which was her only surviving relative at this point, said that she welcomed the reopening of the investigation. Obviously, why wouldn't you? She said that the only thing that was a bummer to her, besides the whole case being a bummer, was that the rest of her family wasn't alive to see potential justice be served. Now, this is so sad, but from what I read, Ana's father, Francis, died in 1994, and her mother, her name was Mary, was so grief-stricken over losing her daughter and her husband that she actually took her own life. And then following that, in 2004, her brother died of a heart attack at the age of, I think, 46. So there was just a lot of trauma in one family. It's so, I can't even imagine. That's so fucking sad, dude. It's just so sad. Anyways, Ana's aunt said of Ana's murder, and I quote, "I am pleased they might finally be able to catch someone for it. I just wish it was sooner, because Ana's dad, mom, and brother are all dead. She was a lovely girl and died in a horrific way. It would have been great if they had lived long enough to see justice. I know that Sinclair has been linked to it over the years, but hopefully someone will be convicted." But at least as of today when I'm filming this, that has not happened, because to this day, her case remains unsolved. Next, we're going to discuss the murder of 36-year-old Hilda McCauley. She went missing in October of 1977, just 2 weeks before the infamous World's End murders. The divorced mother of two disappeared from the Plaza Ballroom in Glasgow, and this was a weird occurrence for her to actually be able to go out and do something. She was a mom. She's a mom of two. Moms do be busy, so getting to actually have a night out to yourself is such a treat. And then this happened to her. This was a rare occurrence for her to do something for herself, to go out drinking, go out dancing, have a fun Saturday, and just be a woman and not just a mother. So she left her boys, 13-year-old George and 9-year-old Mark, with her mother Martha, and went out for the night. But like all the others we've discussed, she never came home again. Now, apparently she went to a few bars before meeting up with a friend at the plaza, and she was seen entering the plaza's main foyer, F-O-Y-E-R, foyer? She was seen entering at about 12:30, but most people didn't see her leave, and those that did, because there were a few that did, or said they did, said that they saw her leaving with a smartly dressed man. Her body was found less than 12 hours later, and when she was found, just like Ana, she had been bound at her hands and feet, and she had suffered numerous injuries to her head. She was raped and strangled, and the lead on the case called this murder a particularly brutal murder. The killer had also taken her coat, platform shoes, and handbag, and her body was discovered. It's so sad. Her body was discovered by kids who were out picking blackberries by an area referred to as Lover's Lane. And apparently this was an area where like numerous bodies had been dumped, from what I read, because it was an area that you could easily get to and get away from without being seen. So initially police didn't know who the body belonged to. Like, they didn't know who the victim was. So they were doing everything they could to try to figure it out so that they could identify her, you know, tell the family all that, start the investigation. But they didn't have to look very long because her mother, Martha, ended up coming to the police station and she was like crying, and she said that she read the description like that the media had put out of the victim, and she just knew it was her daughter because she had put 2 and 2 together, and her daughter had never come home, and now there was this body that fit her description, which is just, it's so sad too, because her mother said that Hilda lived for her children and now they were left with no mother. And that's just, it hits different these days, you know? It really does. It really, really does. I cannot imagine leaving my son. Like, oh my God, no. The investigation into her murder was hard. First off, there should have been a lot of witnesses, because there was like 1,000 different people who had been at that Plaza Ballroom, right? Like, they should have been able to find plenty of people who saw something, but a lot of the people who were there didn't want to like talk to police, and they didn't even want to admit that they had been there, because apparently these like situations were often like the patrons were generally single people, and a lot of these people that were there weren't single, and they didn't want like their wives, husbands, boyfriends, all that jazz to know that they had been there in the first place. So that was one obstacle, and they were trying to do everything they could. Like, they even looked, again, like in Helen's case, they looked to see if Bible John could have been responsible for this murder also, but apparently he was ruled out. It was seen to be pretty, they were pretty certain that he wasn't involved. So again, they're just hitting brick wall after brick wall, dead end after dead end. I cannot imagine how frustrating it must be to constantly be running into dead ends when looking into a case like this, but that's what happened. The case went cold, and like all the others to this day, it has never been solved. Now, 2 weeks after this was the infamous World's End murders, and this was again the murders of 17-year-old Helen Scott and her childhood friend, 17-year-old Christine Eady. Angus Sinclair was convicted of this crime after he was acquitted during one trial. The double jeopardy law was subsequently changed, new evidence was found, and they nailed him to the wall after decades of investigation. I covered this case at length. It's probably my longest video. I think it is my longest video to date. So if you want all the details on that, I would suggest watching that video, because I'm not going to be able to like, this video is for the victims that weren't covered in that video, but it's part of the timeline. So this is when that happened. If you want to know all about that, check last week's video. It's so interesting. Like, it's like crazy interesting. Everything that went on in that case is like, whoo. So 2 months after the World's End murders, in December of 1977, 23-year-old Agnes Cooney was murdered. Agnes was the eldest with 5 younger siblings, and in 1971, both Agnes's mother and grandmother died, and her, being the eldest, took on the responsibility of taking care of her 5 younger brothers and sisters. She had plans on becoming a nurse to take advantage of her caring nature, and she had enrolled in nurses' trainings with plans to make nursing her career once her siblings were old enough to kind of take care of themselves, so that she could go on and make this her career and let this be her future. On the night that she was murdered, she had done just that. She had gone on to become a qualified nurse, and she was living just east of Glasgow's city centre. Now, on the night she was murdered, this was December 2nd, 1977, she had gone out with a friend of hers. This was a girl named Gina, and her and Gina had gone to this club. I can't remember the name of the club. It hardly matters, but she'd gone out to this club, and they were going to see Gina's boyfriend's band. It was like an Irish band, and they were going to watch Gina's boyfriend's band play a show. So the 2 girls got together, they had dinner, they watched the show, heard the music, had a nice night. They even helped the guys like put away their instruments after they did the whole roadie gig. And then Agnes left. On her way out of the club. She said goodbye to the bar staff, like waved, was like later players. And this was the last time she was ever seen alive. Agnes was found the next morning at about 9 a.m., 15 miles away from where she was last seen. She, like the others, had been bound and raped, and she had evidence of strangulation, but ultimately she died from being stabbed in the neck, and she was covered in defensive wounds. She really fought hard. She seemed to be the one that fought hardest out of all of Angus's victims. And it's really sad, because after Angus was convicted of the World's End murders, Agnes's sister came out pretty upset because there was justice there, but not justice for her sister. And she said specifically of this, and I quote, "Everyone has let us down. We tried to get a case to get justice for Agnes, but we can't, because there's nothing. God is the only one now who can do anything. And apparently, like, police officers went to Agnes's family and they apologized. They apologized to them for mishandling things and for destroying evidence and for basically not being able to convict Angus of her murder as well, even though they did believe he was connected. So now we're moving on to another murder that Angus actually was convicted of, and this was the murder of 17-year-old Mary Gallagher. On November 19th, 1978, Mary, who was a machinist and just like a teeny tiny girl, left her house saying goodbye to her mother and her sister at about 6:40 p.m. that day and was on her way to meet a friend of hers who lived on the other side of the railroad tracks. It was near these railroad tracks that she was abducted by knife point, and they could tell this because she had this pinpoint cut into her back and it matched with a cut through her clothes. And then she was dragged to the bushes, stripped, raped. Her neck had been compressed and she had been repeatedly struck in the neck with the knife. And then she was strangled with a ligature made out of her own pants, and her throat was slit. It's so sad, man. This girl, who was the eldest daughter of 5 children, was found naked from the waist down in that condition. A ligature had been used on her just like the others, only her cause of death was that neck wound. And her uncle, I believe his name was James, had to identify his niece's body that way. So police actually did have a suspect in mind for Mary's murder, but when they ran his DNA, this person wasn't a match. But when they entered DNA into a database, national database, there was a match. And the match to the DNA on Mary was Angus Sinclair. Now, and though this happened years before, right, it took till 2001 for this DNA to be linked to Angus after there was a cold case review done on Mary's case. The investigation into Mary's murder was reopened in 1997, and because the initial investigation was so thorough, the new investigators had to sort through like a shit ton of boxes, like a shit ton of cardboard boxes, right? All full of evidence, and they went as far as interviewing over 300 people again, even after all this time. And then in 1999, with advances in DNA technology, experts were able to link semen found in Mary's pubic hair to Angus. And they were able to determine that this DNA, the chances of this DNA belonging to anyone but Angus was like 1,000,000,000 to 1, because it was clear that it was him. So he was like, you know what, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to say that the sex was consensual, right? So that's why my DNA was on her, and that somebody must have gotten to her right after me and killed her. And the jury was like, that sounds like bullshit, dude. And for the record, in case you missed last week's video, that's what he said in the World's End Murders also. So this seems to be his go-to, even though it's bullshit, right? Anyway, after a 12-day trial and just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury of 6 women and 8 men found 56-year-old Angus Sinclair guilty of Mary's murder. And this was like decades after the fact, so that is amazing. He denied everything, of course, but this didn't stop him from being sentenced to life in prison. But he would have been up for parole in 2016. And it's wild that they convicted him. Well, I mean, DNA is DNA, but when they went, like the jury, right? The jury had no idea that he had previously killed 7-year-old Catherine, the first victim that we talked about. Like, that wasn't expressed to the jury. They weren't privy to that information. And they also didn't know that at the time that he went to trial for murdering Mary, he was already in jail, serving life in prison for a bunch of violent assaults and rapes on children, which is something that I talked about in last week's video. Mary's family was blown away when Angus got arrested for Mary's murder. Like, they had never given up hope, but they had kind of given up hope, right? Like, they really didn't think that anyone would ever actually be brought to justice, just because so much time had gone by from her murder to him actually being caught. They had a lot of built up emotions after all the years of waiting for justice, and when he was in court, they like screamed at him in court, and the judge called his crime a callous, brutal, and depraved act on a young girl. After the verdict was read, Mary's mom didn't speak to reporters. From what I can tell, it said that she just slipped out the side door and quietly took a taxi home just to stay out of, like, you know, the media and the spotlight. She was dealing with a lot. But her uncle James did speak to the media, and he said, and this is the uncle, by the way, who identified her body. And he said of the verdict, and I quote, "The family have never got over the tragedy. We are happy that this evil man has finally been brought to justice, but our pain and suffering is so deep, it will never go away." And then the lead investigator on Mary's case said of Angus, and I quote, "He's one of the most evil people I've certainly interviewed in my life. There were things going on in his head which clearly I couldn't reach." So after being able to solve Mary's murder with DNA evidence that was that old, after it had been a cold case for so long, investigators were thinking to themselves like, maybe it's time that we start looking into other cold cases and see what we can kind of do here. And this is how Operation Trinity was born, which is what I talked about a little bit towards the beginning of this video and at length in last week's video. Anyway, to make a long story short, Operation Trinity determined that the murders of Frances, Hilda, Agnes, Anna, Christine, and Helen were all committed by the same person, and they then presented their findings to the Crown. But because of the lack of physical evidence, the Crown decided not to pursue Angus on the murders of Frances, Hilda, Agnes, and Anna, and instead decided to only go after him for the World's End murders, which was the murders of Helen and Christine. Former Detective Alan Jones, which I'm just going to call him Mr. Allen, Mr. Allen said that Angus was the type of killer that Scotland had never seen in modern times. He was basically like, listen, there are serial killers in other countries, America, like really intense ones, but in Scotland, in this time, there is nothing to even compare this monster to. Now, it was believed that even though there wasn't the physical evidence needed to prove it, that Angus was responsible for these murders. And I guess his caravan was even spotted at several of the crime scenes. Like, they were like, I know this is the guy. So they decided that they wanted to get kind of a second opinion on what they had found. So they reached out to the FBI and they spoke to a retired FBI agent named Mark. So Agent Mark. And Agent Mark, spent months poring over all the evidence on these cases to make his determination. Agent Mark said of this, and I quote, "They brought 6 cases, and really the request for us was, can you look at all 6 of these cases and render an opinion about whether you think these cases are linked or not? And we requested all the case information, photographs, autopsy reports, anything that they had back from 1977. And after our analysis, it was really clear to me, I felt very strongly that all of these crimes had been committed by the same offender." They looked at their victimology, the motivation involved in the crime, where the women had been abducted from. They looked at autopsy photos. They looked at literally everything that police had collected during their investigations. They looked at what similarities and what differences they had, how they were killed, the weapons used, how and when they were taken, everything. And the FBI was confident that all of these murders were committed by the same person. FBI agent Mr. Mark said that, like, if you looked at these cases, there were several areas of linkage. And if you took a step back and you looked at the big picture, it became clear that they were related. You had all these women being stolen from a relatively small geographical area, right? Edinburgh and Glasgow. And they were all gagged, bound, raped, killed, and discarded in the same way, or a very similar way, and all within a 6-month period. He also theorizes that the reason that these murders seemed to stop and he went from murdering women to brutalizing children is because his last couple of victims, Agnes and Mary, fought him back and fought him back hard. They caused him to deviate from his normal plan, and instead of strangling them, he stabbed and slashed their necks, and they had defensive wounds all over him. On top of that, Angus was getting older. Kids are easier, more vulnerable, less physically strong, less of a challenge for him because he was getting older. He's probably not as strong, probably not as agile, and things just weren't going as easily for him as they had been in the past. So Mr. Mark thinks that that's why the murder stopped and he started brutalizing children, and then ended up getting arrested for brutalizing these children because they were small and vulnerable and really couldn't fight him back the way that strong, capable women could. So he was essentially a little baby back bitch who was like, oh, they're gonna fight me back. I might as well start brutalizing the most innocent of living creatures. Children. Now, one of the children that he did assault during this time was a girl named Jean, and she survived, and she grew up to tell her story, and she told a reporter about how he was able to lure her in the first place, which gave us some insight to how he committed these crimes. She says that Angus asked her if she wouldn't mind taking his change, up to his mom. So he was like, hey, can you take this change up to my mom? And she's like, sure, what door, what room, whatever. So she goes inside the house. And she says that as she's going up the stairs, she hears him advancing on her. And she tries to run, but he catches her and he's like taking off his coat in the process. Like, he's got plans in his mind, which really, when I think about this, it makes me wonder if this is exactly how he got little Catherine when he was 16 to go into the house also. But anyway. She says that he grabbed her and that she told him, like, I need to go, I need to get away. And he told her that if he didn't do exactly what he said, that he would kill her, and he presented a knife. And she said that she was scared and she just did exactly what he said so he wouldn't hurt her, and that she just closed her eyes and she hoped that he would go away. Another girl that survived an attack of Angus was a girl named Pauline, and she says that she was at home with her dad one day when two men, one Angus and one an accomplice who we do not know who that is at the time, came into her home. The accomplice was holding a knife and Angus was holding a hammer. She says that these men then took her and her father, they gagged them and they bound them at their feet and their wrists before Angus beat them with the hammer and then robbed their home before leaving. Apparently, by the way, he did this. I mentioned this in the beginning that he used to do this, but apparently he did this while he was on his lunch break from his job as a painter. Remember I said he was a painter and he would leave on his lunch break and do shitty things? This is one of the shitty things that he did. And this little girl, Pauline, said that when he came into their house, he didn't just steal their money, he stole her sense of safety, like feeling safe in her home, which is just like so up, man. What's really sad here is, again, someone else ended up getting arrested and charged with this crime, and they didn't find out until later that it was actually Angus when his accomplice actually confessed to it later. I didn't see who his accomplice was, as I said, but I don't think it was Gordon, the one that he went on to kill with. But either way, somebody else got arrested for this when it was Angus. Like he had a horseshoe up his ass, this guy did. It is unknown how many kids Angus attacked during this time. He was finally caught in June of 1982 after he violently sexually assaulted a 6-year-old girl named Lynn. I can't even deal with that. And she was able to identify her attacker as Angus due to the smell of turpentine on him and the flecks of paint that he had in his hair and his shoes because, again, he was a painter. At this time, he was 37 years old and he pled guilty to 11 charges of rape and indecent assault, although he admitted his victims could be up in the hundreds. Hundreds of kids. He is so nasty. That is so gross. Where is Gary Plausch? Am I right? Like, where is Gary Plausch in these situations? That's all I'm gonna say. Anyways, for these disgusting crimes, he was given life in prison with the possibility of parole. He served 20 years and he was about to be eligible for parole for these crimes when he was caught and convicted of the murder of Mary Gallagher. Okay, now remember how I said that Angus and an accomplice broke into this girl's house and he was wielding a hammer at the time of the assault? Well, that right there is going to lead us into the final murder that we're going to be discussing today, and that is the murder of 63-year-old Eddie Cotogno, I believe is how you pronounce it. Now, this is clearly a murder that doesn't exactly fit his pattern. It's a guy for one, and it is an older man for another, but there is a connection with Angus. Now, Eddie was beaten to death in his home in, I believe it was July of 1979. Eddie had died of blunt force trauma. His head had been beaten in, and they weren't 100% sure on what the murder weapon was, but what do you think they thought it was? A hammer. Yes, exactly. So that happened, and then the murderer went on to set Eddie's apartment on fire to get rid of any evidence of the crime or anything that could connect him to the murder. Now, as I said, there was a connection to Angus. Now, apparently, Angus and Eddie were buddies. They were homies. They were friends. But just weeks before Eddie's murder, apparently Angus and Eddie had gotten into some sort of fight, had a falling out, if you will. And police clearly thought that there was some sort of connection here and that it was worth exploring because they did bring Angus in for questioning, but he was able to give them an alibi by telling them that he had been with his wife at the time and his wife backed up this story. Now, officers in hindsight say that they don't believe that Angus was properly questioned and really looked into for this the way he should have been in the very beginning. I guess back then, they used to call ahead and be like, ring, ring. Yes, hello. We are going to be coming over and questioning you about a murder, so make sure to get that alibi ready. You know what I mean? So they would give them time to put together an alibi. And Angus was no stranger to lying, right? It wasn't like above him to lie. I mean, he was a pedophile, rapist, murderer. It was theorized that Eddie and Angus maybe got into some sort of fight, perhaps about money, and that Angus had killed him in response to this dispute. Now, is that like a different type of murder than the ones that we have known him to commit? Yes, it's very different. Beating a man to death and then setting his apartment on fire is different. However, is it really, do you really need to stretch before that leap, right? I mean, is it really below this man to kill someone over a dispute when he is willing and able to just randomly murder women this way? I don't think so. And on top of that, years later, years after the initial investigation, police found out that Angus's alibi was bullshit, that he had lied and he had convinced his wife to cover for him and corroborate his alibi. Now, speaking of his wife, well, his ex-wife, because they did get a divorce, she has come out and said that she does believe that Angus is responsible for more murders than he has been convicted of. She said that Angus would disappear for days at a time, and now she believes that he was taking out his caravan to abduct and murder women. She said that he would tell her that he was going back and forth to Edinburgh over and over, but he was doing it for work. She says that she believes that that's not true, that he wasn't going to work, and that instead he was killing women, and she thinks that he continued killing up until he was arrested. Mr. Wood, you remember Tom Wood, we've discussed him several times, the investigator constable gentleman, he said of Angus Sinclair and the years of terror that he imposed on Scotland, and I quote, "Throughout his life, he has been nothing but disaster to almost everyone he has met. He is a violent criminal. He committed extremely violent robberies, a string of very serious sexual offenses against young girls, as well as the murders we now know he committed. And I believe there are probably many, many more crimes he has committed, and we will probably never know." And that is almost a certainty, because Angus Sinclair has died. On March 11th, 2019, he was found dead in his prison cell. He had sustained a number of strokes. He had like several strokes back to back, and he was bedridden or like confined to a wheelchair. And he just like died in the night, and they believe he just died of natural causes. I think it was just his old rottenness just eating him from the inside out, right? That just caused him to like stroke out and die, but that's probably not accurate. He probably just died peacefully in his sleep. What a little piece of shit. Angus Sinclair was in prison for 47 of his 59 adult years of his life. And during his few years of freedom, he chose to murder 4 women that we know of, and then to brutalize countless children. And these are just the things that can be proven. That's insane and disgusting. And then there are the murders of the people we talked today that just simply aren't provable. Francis, Hilda, Agnes, Anna, Helen, and Eddie. And those are just the ones that we talked more about today. There are definitely more. I 100% believe that. I guess there was even a letter leaked that Angus had written where he talked about police questioning him for the murders of a 22-year-old girl named Patricia Black and a 3-year-old girl named Sandy Davidson. I can't even imagine how many people this man actually killed, and just how many women lost their lives to this little stupid prick. And now I'm going to end this video with a quote from Mr. Woods himself, Mr. Tom Woods himself. After Angus Sinclair died, he said, and I quote, "We should be thinking of these young women and their families, not wasting our thoughts on Angus Sinclair." So now that I've told you all the information that I have, all the things I was able to put together, I hope it made sense. I hope it was digestible. I know it was a lot. But now that I've given you all the information, I want you to answer the question of the day, and that is this. Do you believe that Angus Sinclair is responsible for the murders that we discussed today? Do you think he's responsible for some but not others? Let me know in the comment section below all of your thoughts. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and I hope it gave you all the information you would want. I know this is like a different type of case for me to cover, but I felt like these were people whose stories hadn't been like told, you know? Like I felt compelled. I felt compelled to learn all I could, and I felt compelled to bring it to you today. So I hope it made sense, and I hope you found it interesting. And of course, I want to thank you for remembering all of the victims of Angus Sinclair with me today. Please let me know of any cases you would like to see me cover in the future. As you know, I have a long list of cases, but if you leave me a suggestion, I put it on the list with your name next to it, so if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases that you're into because I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste. Otherwise, you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below for your convenience. I've got all of them: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. I also have a link to my merch store in case you are curious. This is a new shirt. At the time that I'm uploading this, it should be October, and I just launched this on the 1st of October. And I'm obsessed, okay? And I also link all the makeup I use and everything down there for your convenience as well. I want to say one more thank you to Dossier for partnering with me on today's video. I love working with them. As you guys know, they were my very first sponsor, and I will continue working with them as long as they want me to. And of course, I want to thank you guys for always being so supportive of all my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. And now, with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. you are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. At the very least, be better than Angus Sinclair. And I hope to see you in next week's video. Bye.